and that's kind of one of the interesting things about story itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
That stories were not necessarily meant to be these static factual things. They were meant to morph and to grow and to change
Mm-hmm.
and to become something bigger or smaller or more detailed or less detailed than they actually are, right? But they're not supposed to be the thing itself.
Welcome to Story Power, a bi-monthly podcast where my guests and I geek out about the stories we are passionate about in all different genres, styles, and formats. And we'll give a few recommendations to you, our listeners. Beware, possible spoilers ahead. My name is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden, and I started this podcast during the COVID-19 pandemic. As I watched the reaction of my social media circle, I noticed that many people turned to stories for comfort and help in making sense of the craziness going on around them. And as all good stories do, the world got even crazier. But, as Neil Gaiman says, fairy tales are more than true not because they tell us that dragons exist, but because they tell us that dragons can be beaten. Since I believe that stories have the power to show us the way and give us courage to keep going, I wanted to see if that was true for my guests as well. Today, in episode 23, I am chatting with Patrick Rhone, and Patrick was introduced to me by our mutual friend, Randy Murray. Randy and I were in college together, and Randy was my guest on episodes 4 and 5. He and I talked so long, I had to split the episode. So, Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
I am so happy to meet you, and I've been looking over your websites. You have more than one.
I do, yeah. PatrickRhone.net is actually my daily blog site. I write everything from longer things to medium-sized things to very, very short things. I have links. I have, photos and videos, and that's kind of just my very personal website. And it really is about what's going on in my life, anything that captures my attention, the things I'm interested in, linking to other things that I read there. It's kind of an everything site. PatrickRhone.com is actually really at this point for just kind of a landing page, as it were, the one place shop for here's a link to PatrickRhone.net. Here's if you want to, buy some of my books right here, sort of thing. I really wanted to really take that .com to heart and make it kind of my professional landing page. Besides that, I do have other interests and other things that I do. And I do have kind of interest-specific blogs for that. And the reason that I do that is that way those things don't kind of take over my personal blog. So one of those is The Cramped, where I explore the joys and the pains of creating, more specifically writing using analog tools, so pen and paper, typewriters. And so, I explore that at thecramped.com, play on writer's cramp or, having a cramped hand from writing. And then
I did check that one out, and I thought that one was fun because I do that same thing. I take my notes from my podcast by hand, and
so what we believe in. And then I also, as I guess a hobby, a passion that happens to also involve making money sometimes, I restore old homes.
That's what that was.
Yeah. So
because I was poking around and I saw that you were restoring a home, and I said, is that your house?
Yeah. It is. I own it, but it is not the one that I live in. It's one that we bought for the purpose of restoring and then selling to someone who will really appreciate it. And that is at woetowow.com. That's WHOA. TOWOW. And that actually has a couple of different purposes, or I should say goals. Goal number one is I do enough of this that I really have fun showing people and writing and taking pictures of the process, right? This is not something that I do professionally. It is not something that I was trained to do. When people ask me, well, gosh, how'd you learn how to do all of that? I explain to them that we bought a house for $7,200. And when you buy a house for $7,200, there's lots to do. And the beautiful thing about buying it for so cheap is that you can make really expensive mistakes, and it's really not that big of a deal. And you can learn a lot that way, right? You learn a lot. The bigger the mistake, the more that you learn is the way that I like to look at it. And so we bought that house and fixed it up, put about $35,000 into it, fixing it up, because was it so cheap? Well, I did most of the work myself. So the labor was quote unquote free. Right. And that's now the house that my dad lives in. We still own that one.
Oh, nice.
1880 farmhouse that my dad now lives in.
Is that in Minnesota?
It happens to be in the city. Yeah. It's actually only 4 blocks north of the state capital. So here in St. Paul. So it's in 1880, that was all farmland back there.
Yes.
That was actually, kind of not too long after Minnesota became a state. And so, so that was all underdeveloped. And now it's an urban area, but still the house, was a farm home originally.
Oh, that's neat.
And so purpose number one is kind of just to show the process and to blog about it and to, basically tell the story of the house as I'm remaking it and kind of rewriting that story. I shouldn't say rewriting, adding to that story. But the plan there is, once I'm also collecting all of those things that go on the blog, they go into kind of a special file all by themselves. And when I'm done and we're ready to put it on the market, I'm going to print 3 specialty books, just 3 copies. And the 3 copies are going to be basically the entire process, all compiled from beginning to end, from the time we purchased it to the time we're done. And there will be a copy for me, a copy for my friend Jason, who I've hired to help me with with this project, because some of this, it's a big enough job that it really does take 2 people. And then a copy that will go with the house. Oh, nice. And I'm going to make clear in the sale that the book stays with the house.
The house, right?
That anyone who going forward who owns that home can see how things were, how they are now, but even more importantly, how they got there. The story of how they got there, right?
Oh, that's so great.
So you could, for instance, the kitchen. Let's say down the road, you have some sort of plumbing issue and you call a plumber. You'll be able to flip open to the page where I have a picture of the new plumbing that went into that wall. And you'll be able to say, this is how it looks behind that wall.
That's great.
And he'll be able to look at it and say, oh, okay, I see exactly, where the problem might be. And I know exactly where to cut into the wall, right? I mean, things like that just would be invaluable for anyone who's buying an old home.
Really?
Right?
Any kind of home. Actually.
Yeah, or any kind of home, right? I mean, I suppose if you're doing new construction, maybe you've got blueprints or whatever, but being able to show that process all along the way, exactly what you did and exactly why you did it and tell the story of that. I think 2 things. Number one, people will be able to use it for very practical reasons like that. But number 2, they'll also be able to see that, people are quick to ask, whoa, so you're going to flip it. you're going to you bought it to flip it. And I'm very quick to correct them. No, I don't flip homes. I restore them. And it's a very different mindset, and it's a very different process.
Mm-hmm.
If I was flipping this home, I would be done already. It would be on the market for money than what we will likely make by the amount of time that it's taking. When this market, with this very hot market we have right now in the Twin Cities, may not be very hot next year. I don't know. But, what I do know is that I really care about doing it right and doing it, things that might take a bit longer, might take quite a bit longer, but in the end, it's going to be worth it because they're done well.
Yes. Well, how did you get to that from writing? Because weren't you a reporter?
No, never a reporter. But certainly, an author, an essayist, someone who has long written online and covered his various interests. I had a very popular website called Minimal Mac, which was all about Macintosh, and basically it was a minimalist approach to technology. Mm-hmm. The idea being that the Mac out of the box pretty much has 90% of everything you really could need, and that you don't have to buy or download a whole lot more to make it a really great and useful tool. And, and that just stemmed out of a passion of mine that literally came to me as I was falling asleep one night about just thinking about the Mac and just how great that is and how it's not the same thing on the PC, and that to do things on the PC, you kind of need to download Microsoft Office, and you need to buy this, and you need to get this, and you need to download that, and that you don't really have to do that with the Mac. Yeah. So gosh, what you asked me is actually a fairly long story that I'll try to compress. Like, how did I get to what I'm doing now from where I was? And so I've been writing since I was very young. I still have the ribbon and the mimeographed copy of the poem that got published in the little school newsletter when I was in second grade.
Oh, wow.
At Pratt Elementary. And I was so proud of that. And I was really, I've been writing for the better part of my young life. But, I was born in 1967. So that meant I was coming upon my teenage years at the early 80s, which was kind of the very beginnings of the personal computer revolution. Mm-hmm. I come from a family of artists and writers and musicians. And so the idea that one could make a life or make a career out of that was never something that was foreign to me, and thus something I was exposed to. But, as at the early kind of beginnings of the computer revolution in the early 80s, I got kind of interested in that. But my interest was mainly from a writing standpoint. I've always been kind of a futurist when it comes to things and thinking long term about things, and thinking about like, I better get to know this computer thing because this is going to replace the IBM Selectric that I type on now, that I was lucky to have access to because my grandmother was a college professor, and so she had this really nice modern cutting edge typewriter at home, and so I got my hands on a little Timex Sinclair, a little tiny personal computer that you could buy at Radio Shack and hook up to your TV as a monitor. And
oh gosh, I forgot about those.
Yes. Use a tape recorder, an actual cassette recorder, to basically run programs on. And the way I looked at it was, this thing has a QWERTY keyboard on it. I can use it for writing, right? And that's what I did. I tried to figure out, how do I use this for writing? Because this is going to be the future, and everyone's going to be using this for writing, and we're going to get rid of these typewriters. And that's how I got interested in technology.
That's so cool.
But technology was always kind of a means to an end for me, right? It was not really about my interest in technology. It was about my interest in writing with the technology,
Right. Yeah.
and publishing with the technology. And how do I make this thing with this keyboard output what's in my head? And so I never really thought of it as kind of being a nerd or being a geek or being super interested in the technology piece of it. I thought of it in terms of being interested in what I could do with it piece of it. And so my hopes and dreams remained throughout high school. My idea was that I was going to be a writer, but I knew that the chances of actually making money as a published writer was far and few between. And I knew that because I saw people who wrote books, and I knew how much money they made. And I knew that they all had other jobs.
Right.
They all did something else for a living and wrote books on the side.
Yeah.
And so my idea was I was going to be an English teacher. And that was the path I wanted to pursue. Went to college to pursue an English degree. About a year into college, decided that college was not my bag, not where I was at that point in my life mentally. Came out of college, came back up to the Twin Cities, went into the Navy for a while, decided that was not my bag. Came back to the Twin Cities, fell in love, got married, worked a bunch of, odd jobs, worked at a video store for a couple of different ones for a while, then front desk at a hotel. And then I saw an ad in the paper where you looked for jobs, and in those days still, back in the early 90s.
When newspapers were still paper.
And, when classified ads and job postings were still in the back of them. And there was an ad for a computer company that was looking for a writer.
Oh.
And now what's interesting about that is that they weren't looking for a technical writer. They were looking for a customer service writer.
Oh.
Because this is before email was a thing. This was back in the days when, there was AOL and there was CompuServe and there was Prodigy. And certainly you could send email within those services to other people on those services, but it was not necessarily something like if I had AOL and you had Prodigy, even at that point, you couldn't send email to me and I couldn't send it to you, right? It was not this, it was this kind of closed thing. And it was just not something a lot of people had. The personal computer revolution was still in its infancy. And so when they had a problem or they had a concern or they were really happy with their product, they would write a letter. Sure, they might make a phone call to customer service, but a phone call to customer service was like, oh, my mouse broke, or oh, I got overcharged for this thing that I never received, right? But if it was like, I'm going to write a strongly worded letter, someone had to respond to all of those letters,
right?
And so they had a customer service letter writing department. It was a team of 4 people, of which I was one. And I literally wrote letters all day. And I would ghostwrite them. So they would either come from the manager of customer service or the president of the company, or even sometimes our chief company lawyer, depending on the severity of the letter and what we needed to say. And so that was my first paid job writing.
Well, that's cool, though.
Outside of the small book of poetry that I self-published when I was 15, because my grandmother worked for a university and they had a small press shop, and she had published 3 books through that press shop, and so I convinced her publisher to let me print off these little books of poetry that I put together, and then sold them personally to friends and family for $5, of which I have one remaining copy that I hope never sees the light of day, because it is exactly as tortured and teenage angst-ridden garbage as you can imagine a 16-year-old poet writing. I was no Amanda Gorman, let me put it that way. And so, basically, fast forward, there came a time when the technical support department needed some technical writing done. They came to me to do it because they knew just from conversation and hanging out and talking with me about the computers and me asking questions and things like that. They figured out that I knew quite a bit about technology, that not only did I have this writing side, but I also had this interest in technology too. And so they basically took me away from the customer service team to do this special project, which I did. But that tech writing project led to me knowing just about everything there was to know about troubleshooting any one of their computer models. And so at the end of it, they said, hey, you don't have to go back to customer service. You could work in technical support here. And, you would be like a senior support person just because of your knowledge and your background now, like how much you know, right? Like you'll come in at like on an upper level. And I was like, yeah, I'm a writer, I don't want to be a nerd, and basically they said, well, in customer service, you're making this amount. As a senior support technician, you'll be making this. And needless to say, I knew which one of those to choose. And so that's how I ended up in technical support and technology.
That sounds a little bit like my husband. He was a graphic artist. And of course, he was doing it all analog. And then he was working for a company that bought Macs for everybody so they could do the graphic arts on Macs. And
yes.
And I called myself a computer widow for a while because he would read all the magazines and all the books. He would do all the trainings.
Well, and the other part of it too is that, I really did enjoy the technology side. I really did enjoy the troubleshooting and the figuring out, solving problems. And quite frankly, being someone's hero, I mean, seriously, when someone calls and they're frustrated and they can't figure it out, and they're beating their head, and you help them out and you figure it out and you fix it for them, they think you're God. And there's this tremendous amount of satisfaction that comes from that. And so, I got into tech support, and then I figured out, so many of these problems would be so much easier and quicker to fix if I could just show up at people's houses and fix them. And then that led me down the idea of, that could be a business. I haven't even heard of anyone doing that. There were people doing it, I'm sure, but I didn't know that. And so from that point on, every other job I chose was with the end goal of learning as much as I could about supporting computers and their related technologies. So I went to go work for a laser printer manufacturer. I learned all about printing and pre-press and all of that stuff. And then after that, I went to go work for a software company and learned everything there was about Mac software. And then after that, I went to a company that dealt in networking and how the internet was designed, and learned all about that so that I could eventually go off on my own and run the technology consulting business I've now had for going on 25 years.
Wow, that's great.
But I never stopped writing. I've always been writing. And
you were always writing on the side.
I was always writing on the side, and all of it was kind of writing with technology for the most part. And it was about, at first it was, I can publish short stories to this BBS that's got a bunch of geeks that are interested in sci-fi and fantasy. So let me write some sci-fi fantasy stuff and post it here, right? And then it was like, there's, this interest in Apple and technology. Well, I could write about that. And so I was always writing about things I was interested in, but most importantly, it was about publishing. It's like, how can I use this tool to put my writing in front of people who will read it?
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you if you did write fiction, and you just answered that question.
Yeah, but it is very rare. I don't consider myself very good at it. It is not my forte. And is not something I actively do. I am much better at the personal essay. I am much better at memoir and prose. I am much better at think pieces, opinion pieces. And that's generally what most people know me for.
Well, I was going to say, when you were telling about going to college to become an English teacher, actually my degrees are in theater. That's two of my degrees are in
Yeah.
theater. But I ended up teaching English, and you would not be able to write on the side if you were an English teacher. So it's a good thing you didn't go down that road.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Well, my mom is a theater professor, retired now, but she, got her BFA at University of Minnesota, got her MFA at the University of Iowa, was assistant director under Lloyd Richards at Yale Repertory Theater.
Oh, wow.
For many years, and then went into academia. She was head of the theater department at University of Northern Iowa for about 10 years, and then was offered a tenured professorship at the University of Iowa for the remainder of her career. And so, I grew up a theater kid, i.e., not a theater kid who's in the theater kid who's backstage because his mom is on stage, and being raised by a bunch of theater nerds who were basically like an extended family growing up. So very experienced with interested in theater as well.
Yeah. Well, and the technology and the stuff that goes on backstage.
I have a lot of really varied interests and experiences, and as you can tell from my multiple blogs, it's difficult to contain them all. Right?
Oh yes, I know. I understand that. Yeah, because I do teach theater part-time to sort of to keep my writing and my blogging and my podcasting. That I just still do that. Yeah, I have other interests too. Like one of my degrees is in religion, so I like spirituality. I like to explore that. I like to explore science, and yeah, I'm not a tech nerd like my husband. But
no, that's okay. Not everyone has to be. Everyone has their own kind of kaleidoscope of interest, and and it sometimes is a Venn diagram, but not always.
Right. I was going to ask, because I was looking at the books that you're reading. What are your favorite types of books that you read? Do you read fiction and nonfiction?
Yeah, both. I mean, I'm not exclusive. I used to read more nonfiction than fiction, but I've really pushed myself over the past several years. And what I'm assuming you're talking about is on my website at patrickrhone.net. I've got a page called Reading,
right? Which
catalogs every book I've read with short reviews since 2012. And if you look at the arc of that page, you'll notice that it was mainly nonfiction. And it has slowly tumbled over into mostly fiction now. And I think part of that is my interest in nonfiction was I really felt like I should be reading to work, and reading to learn, and reading to discover. And, that reading was as much of a kind of a vocation or task or effort as any of the other things I did. And I didn't want to, quote unquote, waste that time. And, I think also I wasn't quite sure what was good. And I also, so I relied on recommendations from people. And when you're relying on recommendations from people in the tech world, you're going to get a lot of one of two things. You're either going to get a lot of nonfiction, or you're going to get a lot of sci-fi and fantasy stuff. And I always felt like if you started a book, you had to finish it. Well, a few years back, I got over all of that. I basically got over all my hangups about reading, and said, you know what? I want to read to escape. That I want to be able to look. If it's not grabbing me in the first 50 pages, I should just abandon and move on.
Yes.
And while that's still difficult for me to do, I do it more regularly than I did in the past, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And so, I've switched to a lot of fiction lately, and I've been trying the past few years. I've had what I like to call a reading goal for the year. It's kind of a loosely held framework of the sorts of things I want to try to read. Last year's goal, for instance, was I wanted to read more women and people of color and immigrants. Basically, it was a no white men rule, just to kind of expand my pool of reading further, stretch it in a way that in a direction that it hadn't really been stretched before. But more than that, having that kind of constraint I find helpful because it reduces the amount of choice and allows me to more easily choose. This year, my reading goal is loosely defined as big books that scare me. Now, that doesn't mean scare as in horror. That means scare as in I'm a very slow reader.
Oh, yes, me too.
And so I tend to, like, if a book is like 400, 500, 600 pages,
mm-hmm.
I'm scared of even starting it because I know that it's like I could read 2 or 3 other books in the time it would take me to read that one. And so there's a lot of books that I've just kind of pushed to the side that I've been interested in reading, but I've pushed to the side because I've thought, oh, that's just too big, you know?
Yeah, give an example. Give an example of one of the books that you think you might read.
Well, the Neil Stephenson writes in kind of, I don't know. He's hard to define genre-wise. You could plug his stuff into sci-fi fantasy, but there's historical elements wrapped into it, and it's kind of weird. But he tends to write big books, and he writes them by hand too, which is even more scary. Basically using a ballpoint pen and legal pads, no less. But he's got a book called Anathem, which is about 600 pages. Mm-hmm. That's one example. That's one of the ones that I hope to get to this year. Right now, I'm reading Area X, the Southern Reach trilogy, which is actually 3 books technically, right? But they've been compiled into a single volume. Mm-hmm. And so it only came to my attention after they've, like, with this new release where they've been compiled, and quite frankly, the cover was so beautiful that I wanted to buy it just for that alone. One of those books that you want to face out on the shelf as opposed to the spine because it's that pretty. And so that's what I'm reading right now. And I just began the 3rd book of that in the volume. So I feel like I'm making good progress there. So yeah, things like that. Rod Chernow has a biography of Ulysses S. Grant that's been on my shelf that I've wanted to read. And I figure, well, I read his Hamilton biography. I should, I've proven to myself that I can get through a big book, especially one of his big books. And he's a fascinating writer. So it looks interesting. It looks like a great book, and it's been on my shelf forever.
I was wondering, you talked about the Cramped and how you like analog writing, and I was wondering if you'd heard about C.W. Pencil Enterprise.
Yes, yes, I have.
Oh, good.
In New York City, yep. Yeah, no, it's great, and the young lady who started it is just fantastic. I've actually had the opportunity to visit there, and the shop is lovely. It's tiny, but it's lovely.
Oh, that sounds fun.
Yeah. Last time I had the chance to go to New York and not to repeat Randy Murray's episode, but I also saw Hadestown with the original cast.
Oh wow! Cool.
And we saw it a week after it opened. So,
oh wow!
So my wife's bachelor's degree is also in theater. Oh. So I really am a theater nerd too.
Oh wow!
Amongst my many interests. And it was one of those things where we were familiar with Hadestown. We were familiar with the project. It actually started as an experimental project that the writer had done with a number of her musician friends, including Ani DeFranco and Justin Vernon of Bon Iver, and these fairly famous in the current music world names, and had recorded this album called Hadestown. And she had always envisioned it as a stage production, but basically did this kind of album treatment of it as an experiment. It came out really well. And so we loved it. We were interested in it. It was something on our radar. We kind of followed along the little bits of news that would come out here and there about the fact that it was being developed into a Broadway show. And the moment that they announced that tickets were going on sale, my wife bought the tickets, and then we booked the plane. By the way, she did the same thing with Hamilton. So we got to see Hamilton with Lin-Manuel Miranda and the original cast as well.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
We only saw it on Disney Plus.
Hey, that was fantastic too.
It was.
I was amazed at how well they captured the experience, and that also it was just as enjoyable if you have seen it live, because it was so well captured, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't even necessarily the same as kind of reliving it.
Mm-hmm.
It was really seeing it from a different perspective. And I really appreciated that as well. So if you've seen the Disney version, you've seen Hamilton, trust me.
That's good to know. Yeah, yes. We don't go to the theater very often because we live down in the southeast corner of the state, and Tucson's almost 2 hours away from us. We're a mile from the border.
Wow.
And but fortunately, right before the pandemic, unfortunately for them, but they're still alive, this new little theater company started, a Sierra Vista Community Theater, and the mall is dying, but they took over some spaces in the mall, and that's where their theater is, in our little mall. And yeah, so my friend Dave Dahl, who's a theater professional, is going to be doing his master's project there with them and the college. It's a joint thing in December. That's going to be fun. I'm just helping him.
Yeah.
But
we're very blessed here, as you may know.
Oh, yes. I've been to the Guthrie.
The Minneapolis is lousy with theater. I mean, lousy in the old-fashioned meaning of the term. In other words, you could almost wave your hand and hit a theater here in the Twin Cities.
Yes.
We have a lot of theater here. It is a very, very active theater community. It is a very diverse theater community. There's just about anything you could possibly imagine. Just 4 blocks up the street from me is Penumbra Theater, which is, for African American theater. It's huge in the world of African American theater, and it's where August Wilson, his house is 2 blocks away from where I live.
Oh, wow.
And that's where he premiered and workshopped a number of his plays, was at Penumbra.
Wow. Oh, wow. I didn't remember that.
Yeah. So, and my mom was one of the founding company members of Penumbra.
Cool.
Just to give you an example of like how much theater is here.
Yeah.
And so we are very, very blessed to not only have access to and experience a lot of theater. And my wife, as I mentioned, her bachelor's is in theater. She worked for many of the theaters in town. She has a number of clients now that are theaters in town. And so we see a lot of theater.
Oh, wow. That's great.
I mean, obviously pre-pandemic. Once this is all over, we'll be seeing the same amount all over again. Yeah.
Yes. Well, Dave works in Alaska and Colorado, but now he's to the place where he doesn't want to travel all over the country doing theater anymore.
Yeah, well, that's why my mom was like, "Ooh, academia. I think I can just go somewhere and they'll just write me a big check and I'll just stay in one place and I can produce all the theater I want."
Yeah. So that's what he's wanting to do, to kind of develop it a little more here for the college. And then also, be involved in the couple of little theater companies that are starting up here in Sierra Vista. So, yeah. And Tucson's not that far from Sierra Vista. We're a half an hour, 45 minutes from Sierra Vista. So, Tucson's more like an hour and a half. Well, this has just been so fun. Do you have any recommendations of books that you have enjoyed that you might want to recommend to our listeners?
So we have another hour to go, right?
Whoa. Sure.
Wow. Well, I'm really enjoying Area X. I've already mentioned. Here is, I think, what I would recommend, because there's just so much out there, and there's so many good books, and there's so many important books right now for people to read, right? And it really is about, like, okay, do you read to escape, or do you read to learn and grow? And there's just so much out there from so many voices that it really is, like, hard to go wrong these days. On the nonfiction side, I'm going to start there. I think The Good Ancestor is a really good one to read right now. It's about long-term thinking, how to be better about it, how to engage with it. If long-term thinking is something you already do, like I kind of already do it, it may be kind of like to you, like, I already know all this stuff. Yet still, it's engaging and important and well written. And I still, took a lot of validation out of it. If nothing else, really, really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed The Story of More, How We Got to Climate Change and Where to Go From Here by Hope Jarrett. It's the best take on climate change I've yet read. It's straightforward, it's down to earth, it's fact driven, it's empathetic, it's approachable, it's practical. I mean, and it's cautiously hopeful too. I think so much what we read right now is doom and gloom. And while certainly, we need to have that kind of urgency, it's not really necessarily all that helpful at times. Sometimes you want to at least have a little hope that we can do it, not just that we need to. And so I really enjoyed that on the nonfiction side. And a book I keep coming back to that is just very, very strange and weird, but every time I engage with it, and I've now read through it 3 times, I always kind of come away and take away something more. And that is Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown. It is a cross between kind of an action guide for social change filled with a lot of Octavia Butler fandom.
I have only read one Octavia Butler.
Oh my gosh. Which one, by the way?
The Parable of the Sower.
Yes.
And it was so, and I read it shortly before the pandemic, and then I said, I can't read the rest of this right now.
Not the time to read that book.
Yes.
No. So on the fiction side, I really surprisingly and picked up just on a whim The Murders of Molly Southbourne by Tade Thompson.
Oh.
And I don't want to give any of it away. I guaranteed is one of those things that you pick up and you start reading it and you're like, you can't put it down. You can't stop reading it. It's crack. it's horrible. But it's relatively short. And so it's okay. You'll only waste a couple of hours on this, unless you're a slow reader like me, in which case it's about 6. But it's short, it's taut, but it's so much fun. It's just such a fun ride.
Great.
And I almost immediately went and downloaded the Survival of Molly Southbourne, which is the sequel. And I can only imagine that there will be a third. There might already be, and it hasn't come across my radar yet. Highly, highly recommend that for fiction. Also for fiction, The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel. You want to avoid during the pandemic. Her previous book, which was about a flu pandemic that swept through and killed a lot of people, and the world recovering from that. So avoid that one. But The Glass Hotel is not, and I highly recommend it. A really, really great book. And everything by Octavia Butler is fantastic. Everything by my friend J. Robert Lennon is fantastic. And he just came out with a new book that I have not read yet, but I'm anxious to get to, called Subdivision. It just got written up in last weekend's New York Times book review. Cool. And it seems really fascinating and fantastic. But I know, based upon his earlier work, including Broken River, that you can't go wrong with J. Robert Lennon. Pick up any of his books and you will be rewarded for doing so. And my guess is that it's an author you may not be readily familiar with. He's just a fantastic writer. He's a creative writing professor at Cornell. Because like I said, even the published writers who get written up in the New York Times Book Review have day jobs.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the way it was with Ursula Le Guin, and I was getting my master's of theater at Portland State, and she was teaching there at the time.
Yeah.
And I didn't ever take any. I mean, she wasn't on my radar then, so I didn't take any classes from her.
Right.
Of course, I was getting my master's in theater, so maybe I couldn't really have gone outside my discipline to do that at the time.
Yeah. But also rereading books that I loved then and seeing if they hold up now. Because I think reading things at different stages of your life can also be interesting. Because you may find that this thing that meant so much to you when you were a teen and like really changed the way that you thought about reading and writing and things like that, you go back and read and you're like, what was I thinking, right? Or sometimes you go back and read and you come away with a completely different idea than you thought, or lesson or takeaway than when you thought when you were younger and had less experience.
Yeah.
And I don't think we do enough of that. I think there's so much flooding us with the new.
I don't read a lot of new, unless it's been around for a while and then people are still talking about it, then I might.
Yeah.
Well, except for things like Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, because it kind of went along with my religious studies stuff.
Yeah.
But then I found a better series, one that I liked a whole lot better. And it's 3 books. And the first one is called The Expected One. And it's basically the same kind of story as the Dan Brown, but it's slower and takes place over years. And I'm not, there were times when I'd have to put the Da Vinci Code down and go, I have to catch my breath because it just, it takes place over 48 hours or something.
Yeah.
And I was like, I need a break. But this other one that starts with The Expected One, I just found it on a table of, $6 books. And I read the first one. I loved it so much. I bought another one so I could let people borrow it. And then I bought the other 2 in the series and I really loved it.
That's great when you can, find something adjacent. It's one of the things I love about bookstores is in small independent bookstores where, like, I don't know, the staff know you and you can walk in and you can talk about books. And, the number of times I've come away with, well, if you like this, you'll really like this. I can't even count on one hand that come out of those interactions. I just yesterday stopped into a little local indie bookstore and I was special ordering a book for my wife, and the question was, came up, what are you reading? Well, I'm reading the Uriax trilogy. Well, if you like this, and when we were talking back and forth about that, and then I was looking around at, like, the books on the tables and on the, on the stands, the featured ones. And I said, you've got a lot of books out about trees. And they're like, yeah, well, it's kind of because of this new one that came out that's about this botanist who has discovered, like, how much trees are sentient. Like, like how much a forest is actually a community and that they talk to each other using fungi and and all of this, and that we've put out these other books to kind of complement that. But It's like, well, if you like this book, you'll be interested in these as well.
Yes.
But you really should get this book because it's fascinating. It's really cool.
Yes.
And I should have just bought it right there on the spot, but I didn't. Since we're talking about it, I should probably mention the name of that book, Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest by Suzanne Simard, S-I-M as in Mary, A-R-D. It just recently came out, but it is getting rave reviews, and mainly because it has completely upended the world of tree study and exactly how, I don't know any other way to put it, how that trees are living, thinking creatures. Like this is really like set out to not only uncover that, but to prove it, and does a very convincing job of doing so. And that once we understand that, it changes basically the entire way that forestry has worked thus far. So yeah, it's fascinating in any case.
Well, do you like historical fiction?
I love historical fiction.
I don't know if you. This is really an old book again.
Yeah.
But anything by James Clavell, and
yes.
Shogun was the one that I loved the most.
Yeah, back in the day, made into a popular, was it a miniseries?
Miniseries. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Remember the glory days of the 1970s miniseries? I mean, Roots was a miniseries, right?
Yes. I've not seen the new Roots. I loved the original one.
Yeah, I haven't seen the new one either. But once again, I loved the original back in the day when it was on.
The Thornbirds was really
cool. My gosh, the Thornbirds. Oh, the priest who falls in love with the young woman. And oh my gosh, yes.
And that's a book and a miniseries that I absolutely loved. And now I'm not sure I could love it.
Well, because it's kind of creepy.
It's not just creepy. It's like you suffer and then you die. That's sort of the message of that. And I'm not there now. I'm
true. But it's the same reason I can't read Lolita anymore. You can read Lolita when you're young and you don't understand that this is an old guy obsessed with a 12-year-old. Right?
Yeah.
And that's horrendously wrong.
Right.
And the same thing with the Thornbirds.
Right.
Priest meets young lady when she's like 13 or something. I mean, she's like,
I think she's younger than that when you first
younger than that. Yeah, she's a child, basically.
Yeah, she's 8 or 10. Yeah.
And it's like, okay, that's just like, it's already bad enough that you're a priest and you're creeping on with your vow of chastity, but she was 8.
I know.
when you met.
Yeah. I don't know. I can't watch that one anymore or read it. Yeah.
Right. Right. I mean, so many of these things that like we have long looked at with these things were written with a male gaze.
Mm-hmm.
And we have now come to understand that oftentimes the is distorted and wrong.
Yeah.
And disrespectful.
Yeah.
Just downright criminal in some cases.
Yes, right. My sister, I just published today the episode with my sister and I talking about movies that are subtly feminist from the classic era, and the actresses like Bette Davis and Barbara Stanwyck and others that just they kind of bucked the studio system to do what they wanted. And but there are movies now that I just can't watch because they're creepy.
They were okay. Here's an example. So I have a 13-year-old daughter.
Yes.
And my wife and I last year, during the pandemic, we're thinking, she's the perfect age for us to introduce her to all of those John Hughes movies that we loved when we were that age.
Oh, right? Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So, because we remember them as these formative movies that really influenced us during that time in the 80s and as teenagers, and they really got our teenage angst and what we were going through in high school and the sorts of things that were happening, and that she was really going to get a kick out of that. And so we put on 16 Candles. And we're not even 20 minutes into it, my wife and I are like looking at each other, practically crawling under the couch with embarrassment over some of this stuff, because it's really, once again, male gazy. You know what I mean? And then you start to realize that John Hughes was kind of doing this with these young actors and putting them into these kind of very sexually driven situations, and that was creepy. You know what I mean? Like like the sorts of situations he was putting a young actress, and who was 13 or 14 or 15, like Molly Ringwald, in was creepy for an old guy to do to a young actress.
Yeah.
And you could say, well, he was just directing. No, he was writing the script too. These were his movies.
That's right.
He was putting young women into these sorts of situations knowingly and with joy and for entertainment.
And they didn't have intimacy coordinators back then.
Nope, they did not. And it was a lot of, and you know how it is in high school. It's a lot of crude, crass, sexist humor, and a lot of stuff that just isn't cool. And it isn't even cool to Beatrix's age group anymore.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like the sensibilities have completely changed, even for that age group. So you could say, oh, well, that's just teenagers being teenagers. No, teenagers aren't like that anymore.
Thank heaven. Yeah.
Thank heaven. Right. And so, yeah, it's really fascinating to go back and revisit some of this stuff and realize like how wrong it was. And how we just don't remember it that way.
Right.
And how it's clouded by our nostalgia. But in fact, it was really, really not right. and that's the thing, right? And Randy was making this point on the episode that he was on, right? Our memories are a story. Right? Our memories are not fact.
Right.
Our memories are a story about an experience, right? It is not the experience. And therefore, we might have memories about these things that are a different story than the story that they actually are. Because the story we're telling is not to repeat that story. It's to repeat the experience of having experienced that story, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of one of the interesting things about story itself, right? That stories were not necessarily meant to be these static factual things. They were meant to morph and to grow and to change and to become something bigger or smaller or more detailed or less detailed than they actually are, right? But they're not supposed to be the thing itself. And that once you understand that, once you accept that, it can really change the way that you look at even, not just the things that you remember, but, even the things you encounter, right? At that point, what is news, but a recounting of story by someone who witnessed it, which may or may not be accurate.
Right.
And that's not to say that we shouldn't trust the facts, but to understand that even the truth is based on perception, right? And that the perception that we had of, say, the movie 16 Candles when I was a teenager is different than the perception I have of it today.
Right. Exactly.
Right. Yeah. And that doesn't, nothing changed about the movie. Exactly.
Yeah, the movie's the same.
The same. The scene by scene is the same. But the story that I tell myself, the experience I have, the perception I have of it is what has changed. And that is what is different.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And therefore the story is different to me now.
Well, and that's the same with the books that you said you like to go back and reread because you had one experience when you read it earlier in your life, and now you're having a different experience.
Exactly.
With it.
Yes. And maybe it's a better experience. Maybe it's the same experience. Maybe it's a worse experience, but it doesn't matter. No matter what, it's going to be a different experience than what I had the first time around.
Yes.
Right. And that it's important to confront that. It's important to experience that from time to time to kind of make one see the imperfections and the flaws in their own gaze,
Right.
in their own perception.
Oh, yeah.
And how that can influence the way we world.
Yeah.
And the one thing we didn't get to talking to, by the way, and we probably should wrap this up in just a few minutes, that I was hoping we would somehow stumble our way into is I've also been all along fascinated with the stories I don't know.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So Randy, I think initially was hoping I'd get on and tell a bunch of my family stories because I have a lot of interesting family stories because I have a very interesting family. But in an effort to make this less confusing, I am the 6th generation Patrick O'Meal Rhone. Okay. So my great grandfather, also named Patrick, had a brother, and his brother was a newspaperman, a reporter. He founded the Waco Messenger in Waco, Texas. The Waco Messenger was the first Black-owned and published newspaper in the United States.
Oh, wow.
Still going strong. Although it took a hiatus, so it hasn't been continually published, but it was the first. And so my great uncle, that would be my great uncle, my great grandfather's brother, wrote him a letter one day that started off with basically this. I can read it to you. It's, "Dear Pat, this is the history of the family as best I know and have been told by various older members of the family. This is at your request because you know so little of the family history as you came along at a time when the family began to be scattered. Am hurrying to get this done because so many things I've forgotten and others have begun to become indistinct in my mind." So what's great about this is that he's already acknowledging, number one, that he's forgotten some of this stuff. Right? Number two, his memory, even with the stuff that he knows, is beginning to fade. So he's trying to put it down. And number three, because he's a newspaperman, because he's a reporter, it's very well written in that he packs a lot of information into the 8 pages that he wrote.
Wow.
And he tells the story of our family from our arrival as slaves in this country up to their present day. And it's full of fascinating stuff, right? But what's really interesting about it to me is the stories he doesn't tell. I'll give you an example. Our grandmother lived in the same place and was owned by a family named Rhone. Her name was Hetty. Our mother, Hetty, was later married and had 7 children: Lizzie, Emma, Jim, Dave, Will, Erastus, and one more. So he goes through and he tells the story and he says what Lizzie's up to and what Emma's up to and what Jim is up to. All these very common, names that you would expect to hear. What's happening with Will. And he gets down to Erastus and he says, "I'm sure you know all about Erastus, so I say nothing about him." And I'm like, wait, what? What? Like you have all of these run-of-the-mill sort of names, and you leave out Erastus. First of all, how did this poor child end up with the name Erastus? And not Jimmy or right. Like, I'm sure there's a whole story behind that, right? There's a whole story about how Lizzie and Jim and Emma had a brother named Erastus. Secondly, I want to know everything there is about Erastus because it's obvious that Erastus was a character. He was either a character or he was close enough with my great-great-grandfather that his brother didn't have to say anything about Erastus because he knew all about Erastus, right? And so either one of those things is highly interesting, right? Now, with a name like Erastus Rhone, I could probably pretty easily find out who Erastus was, what Erastus did, what happened. At least, I could find out like, oh, okay, he appeared to work here and he appeared to, to do this, or he went to this college, or he got drafted into the army, or, what I mean? Like it should be a fairly easy name to find because it's so unusual.
Mm-hmm.
I also have experience with doing that kind of family research. I haven't. You know why? Because the story not told is actually more interesting to me. The director, J.J. Abrams, has this great TED Talk that he did years ago where he comes on stage and he has this box. It's kind of this basic, a cardboard box with a question mark printed on it, and like printed on like mystery box. Could be anything inside or something like that. And he explains how he went to this magic shop all the time. He was obsessed with magic as a kid, and he was a pretty good magician, and that he saw this box on the shelf, and he loved the idea that this box had all of these magic tricks that he was going to learn how to do, but that he couldn't bring himself to open the box. And then he still keeps this box like on a prominent place on the shelf behind his desk, unopened, has never opened this box to look inside. And once you understand that about J.J. Abrams, all of his films begin to make sense. He's obsessed with the idea of mystery. He's obsessed with the idea of not really knowing, of not really showing you the creature, of not really showing you what's inside the box, because what could be inside the box is a lot more interesting and, in his case, a lot more frightening than what actually is in the box, right? Mm-hmm. And that's how I feel about Erastus. I can make up all sorts of stories about the exploits of Erastus Rhone and not know any of them are true, and know that I'll either A, be way off the mark or be right on it. And it doesn't matter.
Oh, that's so cool. I love it. That reminds me of a Morgan Freeman movie that I've recommended before, but it's the Magic of Belle Isle, and he's a writer. He became a writer because he was in a car accident the day that he got signed to the majors when he was a baseball player, and his wife encouraged him to become a writer, and his wife has died, and he's in a really bad way, and so he goes to Belle Isle to house sit at this house, and he drinks a lot. And next door is a woman who has 3 daughters, and one of them wants to be a writer. And she keeps bugging him and bugging him and bugging him until he finally says, okay, I'll help you become a writer. Yeah. And he tells her to look down the street, and he says, tell me what's not there.
Yeah.
And she doesn't get it at first.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he keeps saying that, okay, tell me what's not on the beach at the lake. Yeah. Tell me. Yeah. And finally she gets it, and she starts making up these stories about what's not there.
Yeah, exactly. There's just a wonderful fascination for me with these stories that aren't told, these things that you don't see, that you have to make up.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I'm not so good at that. It takes me a long time to make up the thing that's not there. That's why it takes me so long to write my books.
Well, and that's one of the reasons why I'm not necessarily a fiction writer, because, because it is a lot of, tell me what's not there. Right. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the fiction that I do write, I tend to navigate towards, kind of futurist sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I come up with these ideas, and it takes me so long to get around to writing them. Like, I have the basic outline of the idea in my head, but I because I'm not a fiction writer, I don't really take the time to do the, sitting down and actually getting it down and figuring out how to tell this story. And then by the time I do, it seems this stuff begins becoming real. So, so I'm like, well, okay, it's no longer fiction anymore. And now maybe I should just research and write about this thing that's actually happening. Um, you know, one of my fiction stories was about basically the upshot of it. The punchline of it is that every star that's in existence is a failed human experiment on some other planet.
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
And that basically humans evolved to the point where they have the technology to create a star, to solve their dwindling their energy needs, and that they create one, and that's how stars are born.
Oh, wow. That's an interesting idea.
Well, yeah, except it's actually true. There's a project in the currently being built in the south of France called ITER, ITER. If you go to iter.org, you will find much information about said project, but you'll never guess what they are doing.
Creating a star
To solve our energy problems. Yes, indeed. They are literally creating a mini sun.
Wow, cool.
And that's the goal of the project, is to have completely clean burning fission.
Wow. I love it.
Yeah. So in any case, I digress. Bottom line is that I keep thinking up things 10 years before they happen. 20 years before they happen in this.
And then you don't write them.
And then I don't write them. See, I need to write them down right then so that I could say, ha, see, I told you.
Right, yeah. Well, this has been so fun. And I'm sure you want to get back to your house.
Yeah, I got to go put a back door into this house, actually.
Thank you so much for being my guest. This has been fun, and I'm going to have to follow you more closely.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. It's been a joy and a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed the show. If you like what you heard, please share it with a friend and give us a review on your favorite podcast app. It will help people find us. You'll find the show notes for this episode at my website, Sage Woman Chronicles, at sagewoman.life. You can leave a comment there. And remember, as Philip Pullman said, after nourishment, shelter, and companionship, stories are the thing we need most in the world. Until next time, this is Lucinda Sage-Midgorden. Thanks for listening.